Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we trace the quiet, forgotten years of a boy left alone on the steppe, abandoned, enslaved, and destined to reshape the world. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your body settle into wherever you are lying. Feel the weight of your limbs against the surface beneath you. Feel the small points of contact, the back of your head against the pillow, the curve of your spine finding its rest, your hands open and heavy at your sides. Breathe in slowly through your nose. And breathe out. Tonight, we are going to travel very far. Not just across distance, but across time. We are going back nearly 900 years, to a world so different from this one that it might as well be another planet. And yet, the people who lived there were fully human. They felt cold and hunger and love and grief, just as you do. They looked up at the same sky you are resting beneath right now. We are going to the steppes of Central Asia. To a land of enormous open skies, of windswept grasslands that stretch without end in every direction. A land where the stars at night are so dense and so bright they seem close enough to touch. A land where the temperature drops to things almost incomprehensible in winter, where the ground freezes solid for months, and where survival was never guaranteed for anyone, no matter who your father was. This is the world into which a small boy was born, somewhere around the year 1162. A boy named Temujin. You know his later name. Almost everyone does. He would become Genghis Khan, the man who would build the largest contiguous empire in human history. The man whose descendants would rule from Korea to Hungary. The man whose influence on the world, for better and for devastation, would echo for centuries. But tonight, we are not beginning with the conqueror. We are beginning with the child. Let your breathing slow a little more. Feel the warmth of your blanket. And let the story begin. Part 1: The World of the Steppe. To understand who Temujin was, and who he would become, you first have to understand the world he was born into. Because the Mongolian steppe was not simply a backdrop for his story. It was a living, breathing force that shaped every aspect of who he became, his instincts, his fears, his strategies, his hungers, his loyalties, and his cruelties. The steppe. The word itself is simple, almost flat, like the landscape it describes. But the reality of the steppe was anything but simple. It was one of the most demanding environments on Earth, a vast corridor of grassland stretching from what is now Hungary in the west all the way to Manchuria in the east. Thousands upon thousands of miles of rolling grass, dotted with rivers and lakes, cut through with mountain ranges, scraped in winter by winds that had no mercy. In the 12th century, this landscape was home to dozens of distinct tribal groups: Mongols, Tatars, Merkits, Naimans, Karaits, Angurats, and many others. These were not primitive peoples in the way that word is sometimes carelessly used. They were extraordinarily sophisticated in their own domain. They could read weather by the color of cloud formations on the horizon. They could track an animal across frozen ground for days. They could navigate across featureless plains without any landmark visible to an outsider, guided by a knowledge passed down through generations that was as intricate and precise as any navigator's chart. They were, above all, people of horses. The horse was not merely a tool on the steppe. It was a partner, a companion, a measure of wealth, a means of war, a source of food and drink. The Mongol people of this era drank arag, fermented mare's milk, as a daily staple. They ate horse meat when they had to. They learned to ride before they could walk with any steadiness. A Mongol warrior and his horse existed in a relationship so intimate, so practiced, that in battle they moved together almost as a single organism, the rider guiding with his knees, both hands free for the bow. And the bow. Let us pause on the Mongol composite bow for a moment, because it too is essential to this world. It was made from layers of wood, bone, and sinew, carefully glued and shaped and left to cure over months or even years. It was shorter than the famous English longbow but far more powerful for its size, and crucially, it could be used from horseback, a feat that the English longbow could not easily accommodate. A skilled Mongol archer could fire 6 arrows a minute with deadly accuracy, while galloping at full speed, twisting backward in the saddle to shoot at pursuing enemies in the maneuver that historians would later call the Parthian shot. This was the world Temujin was born into. A world of exquisite, hard-won skills. A world of constant movement, the great seasonal migrations of nomadic life, moving from winter pastures in sheltered valleys to summer pastures in the high grasslands, following the grass that fed the animals that sustained all human life. There were no cities here. No stone buildings. The home of the steppe nomad was the gur, what we in the West sometimes call a yurt, a circular felt tent that could be assembled and disassembled in under an hour, loaded onto a wagon or the back of a camel, and carried across hundreds of miles without losing its integrity. Inside a gur, the world contracted to something human-scaled and intimate. A fire in the center, smoke rising through the circular opening in the roof. Animal skins spread across the floor as bedding and insulation. Felt walls that kept out the biting wind with surprising effectiveness. The smell of smoke and boiled meat and fermented milk. And outside, always, the sound of wind, that ever-present companion of life on the open grassland. But if the physical environment was demanding, the social environment was even more treacherous. Because the tribes of the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century were locked in an almost endless cycle of warfare, raiding, alliance-making, and betrayal. There was no central authority. There was no law that stretched beyond the boundaries of the clan. The strongest took from the weakest. Alliances were formed and broken with the seasons. Children were kidnapped. Women were stolen. Horses and cattle, the measures of all wealth, were raided in the night, leaving families destitute and sometimes facing starvation in the winter that followed. This violence was not purely senseless. It had a logic rooted in scarcity. On the steppe, where a bad winter could kill half your herd and leave your family without food, the temptation to raid your neighbor's livestock rather than watch your children starve was a temptation that could override almost every other consideration. And so the cycle perpetuated itself. A family that was raided today raided someone else tomorrow, or nursed its grievance for a generation until an opportunity for revenge presented itself. Into this world of beauty and brutality, of extraordinary skill and constant insecurity, a child was born with a clot of blood in his right hand. That, at least, is what the later Mongolian chronicle called the secret history of the Mongols tells us. It says that when Temujin came into the world, his tiny fist was clenched tight around a clot of blood, a sign, his people believed, that he was destined to be a warrior. Destined, perhaps, for something beyond ordinary life. The secret history of the Mongols is one of our most important sources for Temujin's early life. It is a remarkable document, part history, part mythology, part epic poetry, written in Mongolian shortly after the death of Genghis Khan, probably in the 1220s or 1230s. It is the oldest surviving Mongolian literary work, and it tells the story of Genghis Khan's family across several generations with an intimacy and detail that is sometimes startling. It records conversations. It captures moments of private grief. It includes things that are embarrassing to its subject, moments of weakness, of fear, of moral ambiguity, which suggests that despite its mythological overlay, it preserves genuine memories of real events. But the secret history must be read carefully. It was written to glorify. It was written to sanctify. And it was written several decades after the events it describes, drawing on oral traditions that had already been shaped by the knowledge of what Temujin ultimately became. We cannot always be certain whether a detail is historical or legendary. Whether a sign or an omen was truly observed, or added later to make the story feel inevitable in retrospect. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: a boy named Temujin was born, probably around 1162, to a man named Yasugei of the Borjigin clan of the Mongols, and a woman named Hoilan of the Alkhunna tribe. The location of his birth was most likely somewhere near the Onan River, in what is now northeastern Mongolia, close to the border with Russia. It was a landscape of wide rivers and birch forests and grassland, cold in winter and alive with birds and wildflowers in the brief, intense summer. His name, Temujin, was taken from a Tatar warrior his father had captured just before his birth, a custom of the time, to name a child after a conquered enemy, absorbing perhaps that enemy's power and spirit into the family line. The name itself likely derived from a word related to iron or a blacksmith. Iron was valuable on the steppe, precious and hard to obtain. To be named for iron was in some sense to be named for strength and utility and enduring worth. None of that could have been apparent to the infant himself, of course. He was simply a newborn in a gur, somewhere on the vast cold steppe, his mother exhausted, his father proud and superstitious and perhaps already imagining, in the way that all fathers do, what his son might become. Part 2, Yasugei the Brave, and the story of Hoilan. To understand Temujin's character, it helps to understand his parents. Because the parents we are given, the ones who raise us and model for us what the world is, leave marks on us that persist long after they are gone. And the marks that Yasugei and Hoilan left on their son were deep. Yasugei was a man of some standing in the Borjigin clan of the Mongols. The Borjigin were not the most powerful clan on the steppe, they were not wealthy, not dominant, not feared across the grasslands the way some other tribal confederations were. But they had lineage, and lineage mattered. The Borjigin traced their ancestry back to a figure called Bodonkar, a semi-legendary ancestor who was said to have founded the clan generations before. And through the lines of descent that the secret history traces with careful attention, the Borjigin were related, however distantly, to a figure called Kubul Khan, who had briefly unified some of the Mongol tribes a generation or two before Yasugei's time and had even received an audience at the court of the Jin dynasty in northern China. That moment of Mongol near unity had already passed by the time Yasugei came to adulthood. The tribes were fragmented again, feuding again, raiding one another again. But the memory of Kubul Khan lingered. And Yasugei, as a minor aristocrat of the clan that had produced him, carried that memory as a kind of inheritance, a sense of what had once been possible, and might be again. Yasugei was known as Yasugei Baghader, the word Baghader meaning brave or hero, a title of honor given to men who had distinguished themselves in battle or in great hunts. He was a warrior of repute. He was also, by the standards of his time and place, a man of moderate resources, not rich, not poor, with a modest herd and the loyalty of a few followers. But it is the story of how he came to have a wife, Temujin's mother, Hoilan, that perhaps tells us the most about the world in which this family lived. Because the story of Hoilan's acquisition is not a romantic story in any conventional sense. It is a story of abduction. Hoilan was originally married or betrothed, or in the process of being escorted to her new husband, to a man named Chiladu, a warrior of the Merkit tribe. The Merkits lived to the north and west of the Mongol heartland, along the valleys and forests of the Selenge River region. They were a significant power, and Chiladu was riding south with his new bride when he had the misfortune of being seen by Yasugei. Yasugei looked at Hoilan, perhaps from a distance, perhaps across a river, and decided that he wanted her. This was not unusual on the steppe. The abduction of women from other tribes was commonplace, was in fact built into the rhythms of tribal life in a way that is deeply troubling by any modern measure, but which was, in that time and place, an accepted if resented reality. Yasugei gathered his brothers and they gave chase. Chiladu saw them coming and understood immediately what was happening. He was a practical man in a dangerous world, and he made a practical calculation: he was outnumbered, and his life was worth more than a fight he could not win. He rode away, fast, and survived. But not before Hoilan, watching her new husband retreat, called out to him. The secret history preserves her words, or at least the tradition of her words, and they are both poignant and revealing. She urged him to flee. She told him to save himself. She told him that he could find another woman, another wife, that as long as he lived, there would be other chances for love. And then she removed the sleeve of her shirt, one account says her undergarment, and threw it to him as he rode, so that he would have her sent to comfort him on the road. It is a small, human detail in a violent story. And it tells us something about Hoilan that is important: she was not passive. She was not simply an object being transferred from one man to another. Even in that impossible moment, she was thinking, acting, expressing love and practical wisdom simultaneously. She was saying, in essence, survive. Whatever happens to me, survive. She was then taken by Yasugei and became his wife. The secret history tells us that she wept for Chiladu for a long time, that the wind caught her hair and her grief was carried across the steppe. It does not tell us how long that grief lasted, or what her early life with Yasugei was like. But it tells us enough to know that she was a woman of remarkable resilience and intelligence, qualities that would prove essential in the years ahead. And it is worth noting, the Merkits remembered. Chiladu's tribe, the Merkits, did not forget that Yasugei had stolen Hoilan. They nursed that grievance. And years later, they would exact a terrible revenge, not on Yasugei, who would be beyond their reach, but on his son Temujin. The stolen wife would set in motion a chain of events that would shape the early life of the boy born from that theft. Hoilan would bear Yasugei 4 sons and 1 daughter. Temujin was the eldest. After him came Joki Kasar, then Kajian, then Temuj, and finally a daughter named Temulin. Yasugei also had children by a second wife, a woman named Sachajal, who bore him 2 more sons, Belgutii and Begtur. This blended household, with its half-siblings and its complicated loyalties, would become the crucible of Temujin's earliest moral education. We can imagine that household in its early days. The gur with its felt walls, the fire burning through the night. Hoilan managing the household with the fierce efficiency that the steppe demanded of all women who wanted their families to survive. Yasugei coming and going on raids and hunts, returning with fresh meat and stories. The children tumbling together in the grass, learning to ride before they could properly walk, learning the feel of a bow long before they had the strength to draw it fully. The step childhood was rigorous in ways that we, in our softened modern world, can barely imagine. By the time Mongolian children were 3 or 4 years old, they were placed on horses. By 6 or 7, they were riding on their own, often without a saddle. By 10, a boy was expected to be a competent hunter. The education was entirely practical, the skills needed to survive, to move, to fight, to work with animals. There was no writing, no reading, in this world. Knowledge was oral, carried in songs and stories and the direct transmission of skill from elder to child. But within that practical world, there was also a rich inner life. The Mongols had a complex mythology, centered on a sky god called Tingri, the eternal blue sky, and an earth goddess called Itujin. They believed in spirits that inhabited particular mountains and rivers. They believed in the power of shamans Bu in the Mongol language, who could communicate with the spirit world, heal the sick, interpret omens, and mediate between the human world and the forces that lay beyond it. Religion was woven into every aspect of daily life, not compartmentalized into a temple or a separate day of the week, but present in the small rituals of morning and evening, in the way you approached a river, in the prayers you offered before a hunt. This was the world Temujin was born into. Rich in some ways, brutally hard in others. And it was about to become harder. Part 3, Betrothal and the Shadow That Followed. By the time Temujin was 8 or 9 years old, his father Yasujii decided it was time to arrange his son's betrothal. This was not unusual. On the Mongolian steppe, the negotiation of marriage alliances began early, sometimes even at birth, because marriages were not merely personal arrangements, they were political ones, ways of binding families and clans together, creating networks of obligation and loyalty that could protect you in the dangerous world of tribal politics. Yasuji's decision to seek a bride for Temujin from outside the Borjigin clan was also not unusual. The Mongols had strong customs around exogamy, the practice of marrying outside one's own kinship group. You found brides from other clans, other tribes, and in doing so you created bridges across the tribal world that could serve you in times of need. Yasujii decided to take Temujin east, toward the territory of the Anjurat tribe. The Anjurats were known for the beauty of their women and had a tradition of providing wives to the chiefs and nobles of the Mongol clans. They were, in the language of steppe politics, a bride-giving people, and there was dignity and power in that role, as there was dignity in being a bride-receiving people. Father and son rode together across the steppe. We can picture them, the boy on his small horse, trying to match his father's pace, watching Yasujii with the intense, adoring attention that sons give to fathers they admire. The grassland unrolling around them. The enormous sky overhead, perhaps threatening rain from the northwest, perhaps brilliant with the blue that seemed to reach directly into Tingri's realm. On the way, they stopped at the camp of an Anjurat man named Day Sechin, Wise Day or Day the Perceptive. And it was there that Temujin met, or was shown, the girl who would become his future wife, a girl named Borte. The secret history tells us that Day Sechin had a dream the night before Yasujii arrived, a prophetic dream in which a white falcon carrying the sun and moon flew into his hand. He interpreted this as a sign of the coming of a great family, a sign of destiny. Whether this dream was truly dreamed or was added later by storytellers who knew how the story ended, we cannot say. But the detail speaks to the atmosphere of prophetic significance that always surrounded the figure of Genghis Khan in the Mongolian tradition. What we can say is that Day Sechin was evidently a shrewd man, the sort of man who recognized potential when it stood in front of him. He saw something in Temujin, this boy with the bright eyes, the secret history describes his eyes as having fire in them, a quality of luminousness, and he agreed readily to the betrothal. Borte herself. We know relatively little about her childhood, but what we know is significant. She was apparently approximately the same age as Temujin, perhaps a year or two older. The secret history describes her as beautiful and clear-faced, with a complexion like light. She would grow up to be a woman of tremendous importance, not just as the wife of Genghis Khan but as a political force in her own right, a counselor and a stabilizing presence across decades of upheaval. The love between Temujin and Borte, as far as we can tell across the centuries, was genuine, complicated by events that would test it nearly to breaking, but genuine. The betrothal was agreed. Yasujii paid the customary gifts or promised them. And then, in accordance with another common steppe custom, he left Temujin at Day Sechen's camp. The tradition was that a boy who was to marry into another family would spend time living with that family before the marriage was formalized, getting to know his future bride's people, being evaluated and integrating himself into the household. So young Temujin stayed, and Yasujii turned his horse toward home. He would never see his son again. On the way back, Yasujii stopped at a camp. He came across a camp of Tatars, the old enemies of the Mongols, the people who had been involved in betrayals and killings across generations of steppe history. It was customary on the steppe to accept the hospitality of whoever you encountered on a journey. To refuse was deeply rude and dangerous, marking you as an enemy. So Yasujii accepted the Tatars' food and drink. And sometime in the days that followed, he fell ill. Gravely, rapidly, devastatingly ill. The secret history says plainly that the Tatars had poisoned him. Whether that is literally true, whether they recognized him and deliberately laced his food, or whether he simply fell victim to illness that was later blamed on the convenient enemy, we cannot know. But the effect was the same. Yasujii was dying. He managed to make it home, or nearly home. He sent a messenger to Day Sechen's camp, a man named Munglik, to fetch Temujin. But Temujin arrived too late. By the time the boy reached the family's camp, his father was gone. Temujin was 9 years old. His father was dead. And the family he was now the nominal head of consisted of his mother Hoilan, his siblings, his half-siblings, and very little else. No powerful allies. No large herd. No warriors sworn to their protection. In the brutal arithmetic of steppe survival, they were a family without a man, which meant, in that world and that time, that they were almost without protection. And the wolves, metaphorical and literal, were already circling. Part 4, Abandoned on the Steppe. The death of Yasujii Baghadur was not merely a personal tragedy for his family. It was a political event that had immediate and devastating consequences. On the steppe, a clan's power and a family's security depended almost entirely on the strength of its leader. When that leader died, especially when he died young, leaving children not yet old enough to fight, the loyalty of his followers evaporated with remarkable speed. This was not necessarily cruelty on the part of those followers. It was survival. A man who pledged his sword to a dead chief's infant children was a man who might find himself alone when the next raid came, or without allies when the next hard winter stripped the land. Loyalty was not an abstraction on the steppe. It was a practical calculation, made against a background of constant risk. And when Yasujii died, his followers, the men who had raided with him, hunted with him, pledged their allegiance to him, began, one by one and then in groups, to slip away. What made this desertion even more pointed and painful was that it was made formal and deliberate by the clan elders themselves. The Takiat clan, a related but separate branch of the Borjigin family tree, led by men named Tarkatai Kiriltug and Taduyen Gert, took a decisive step. At the next great gathering, the spring migration feast where the whole community came together before moving to summer pastures, the Takiat leaders refused to allow Hoyland's family to participate. They rode away. They took the great banners of the clan with them. They took the followers who might have remained loyal to Yasugiai's memory. They broke camp and moved on, and they did not invite Hoyland or her children to come with them. There is a scene in the secret history that captures this moment with heartbreaking clarity. An old woman named Hogchen, a servant or former follower, ran to warn Hoyland that the Takiats were leaving. Hoyland leaped onto her horse and rode after them, carrying the standard of her clan, crying out to them, reminding them of their obligations, of what they owed to Yasugiai's memory, of what was right and what was shameful. The Takiat leaders ignored her. A few stragglers, moved perhaps by her courage or by some remnant of shame, turned back and rejoined her. But most did not. And Hoyland rode back to her camp with only a handful of followers, and the knowledge that she was now, essentially, alone. What followed was perhaps the most formative period of Temujin's entire life, more formative, perhaps, even than the great battles and conquests that would come later. Because the years after his father's death, the years of grinding poverty and near starvation and social abandonment, were the years that carved into him the things that would define him: the hunger for security, the rage at betrayal, the fierce attachment to loyalty, the cold understanding of power, the determination that what had been taken from him would be reclaimed. Hoyland was extraordinary in these years. The secret history describes her in terms that make clear she was a figure worthy of the story in her own right. She dug up roots and berries from the riverbank to feed her children. She hunted small game. She taught her sons to fish in the Onan River using needles bent into hooks. She foraged for wild garlic and onion and the various edible plants that the steppe offered to those who knew where to look. She was fierce, relentless, unbowed. The children ate sparingly and worked constantly. Temujin and his brother Kasar became expert at hunting birds along the river. They learned to set traps for small animals. They learned, out of sheer necessity, the kind of self-sufficiency that no comfortable life could ever have taught them. But the deprivation was real and serious. There were seasons when the family had almost nothing. The secret history speaks of times when they ate nothing but wild herbs, nothing but the roots of various plants, nothing but whatever they could find in the riverbank mud. For children, even tough, steppe-hardened children, this kind of sustained hunger leaves marks. It creates an alertness to scarcity, a low-level anxiety about resources, that can persist for a lifetime. It also creates solidarity, and it creates conflict. And it was during these years of deprivation that the first blood of Temujin's story was spilled, and it was spilled not by an enemy, but within the family itself. Temujin had two half-brothers, Belgutiai and Begtur, the sons of Yasugiai's second wife Sachajal. In the rigid hierarchy of a nomadic household, the sons of the first wife outranked the sons of the second. But Begtur was older than Temujin, and in the desperate conditions of those years, he used that physical superiority to take more than his share. The secret history describes specific incidents: Begtur taking a lark that Temujin had shot, Begtur taking a fish that Temujin and Kasar had caught. These are small things, in isolation. A bird. A fish. But when you are genuinely hungry, when every small catch matters to whether your belly aches through the night, they are not small at all. They are injustice made concrete. They are the powerful taking from the powerless because they can. Temujin and his brother Kasar went to their mother with their grievances. Hoyland's response, according to the secret history, was to counsel patience, to remind them that enemies surrounded them, that internal conflict would destroy what little they had. She used the image of 5 arrows bound together being stronger than any single arrow alone, a metaphor that Temujin would later use in his own teachings about unity and strength. But Temujin and Kasar did not heed her counsel. Or perhaps could not. Because what happened next was one of the most disturbing moments in the entire secret history, disturbing precisely because it is told without flinching, without apology, with an almost matter-of-fact directness that suggests it was understood, even at the time of its writing, as a formative truth about the man Temujin was becoming. The 2 brothers crept up behind Begtur as he sat watching the horses. They approached from 2 sides, cutting off his retreat. And they shot him. With arrows. Their own half-brother. Begtur, to his credit or in his despair, did not run. The secret history says he sat still and accepted his death. He asked only that they spare Belgudii, his full brother. And then he died. Hoyland's reaction was fury. She confronted her sons with words that burn off the page of the secret history even now, calling them destroyers, calling them worse than wolves, invoking the isolation and vulnerability of the family in terms that made clear she understood the magnitude of what they had done, not just the moral horror of killing a brother, but the practical catastrophe of reducing still further a family that had already been reduced to almost nothing. Temujin is not recorded as responding to her anger. He offered no defense. And this silence, which might be shame, or might be cold resolve, or might be some complex mixture of both, is one of the moments in the secret history that feels most vividly real. Because it does not give us a clean moral lesson. It does not tell us Temujin wept, or that he acknowledged his wrong, or that he was unmoved. It simply records the fact of what he did, and moves on. What we can say is this: Temujin was perhaps 12 or 13 years old. He was hungry, powerless, abandoned by his clan, watching his mother struggle to feed them all. And he killed the person who was taking his food. The logic is not incomprehensible. It is not admirable. It is human in its worst sense: reactive, desperate, violent. And it hints at something in Temujin's character that would manifest on a vastly larger scale in later life: the absolute intolerance of betrayal, the willingness to use lethal force against those who threatened his survival or crossed lines he had drawn. Part 5: Captivity, the Years of the Slave. It was not long after the killing of Begtur that Temujin encountered the greatest power in his immediate world, the Takiat clan, the relatives who had abandoned his family after his father's death. The Takiats had not forgotten about Usugi's family. And they had, apparently, been watching. They understood, in the way that experienced steppe politicians always understood, that a boy with Borjigin blood and a dead father's legacy was a potential threat. Not now, not as a hungry adolescent scavenging roots by a river. But someday. If he grew. If he found allies. If the old loyalty to Usugi's line that still smoldered in some hearts was fanned back to life. So the Takiats came, in force, with horses and armed men. Temujin's family fled into the forest. The secret history describes a chase, Temujin hiding in the dense stands of pine and birch along the Onan River, moving quietly, holding still, trying to become invisible in the wilderness he had learned so well in those years of foraging and hunting. For 3 days and 3 nights, Temujin hid. The Takiats searched. At one point, according to the secret history, a shaft of light broke through the forest canopy and rested on the place where he hid, a detail that later storytellers would interpret as a sign of divine protection, of Tingri's hand over the boy who would become the world's conqueror. Whether this moment was real or mythologized, it stayed in the tradition, preserved in the secret history as a hint of something larger at work. Eventually, hunger drove Temujin out of the forest. Or perhaps he was simply found. The account is not entirely clear. But the outcome is, he was captured by the Takiats. They did not kill him. This was perhaps because killing the son of Yusugei Baghator would have been politically awkward. There were those who remembered Yusugei with respect, and murdering his boy outright might have cost the Takiats more than it gained them. Or perhaps because Temujin was simply too young to seem genuinely threatening. Or perhaps because the Takiat leader Tarkatai had some other plan in mind. Whatever the reason, they put him in a kang instead. A kang was a wooden yoke, a heavy frame of wood that fitted around the neck and extended to either side, immobilizing the arms, making it impossible for the wearer to feed himself, to lie down comfortably, to do almost anything without assistance. It was a device of humiliation as much as restraint. It announced to everyone who saw you that you were a prisoner, a slave, a person stripped of all dignity and autonomy. And Temujin was made to wear it as he was moved from gur to gur through the Takiat camp, displayed, humiliated, kept alive as a demonstration of Takiat power over the remnants of Yusugei's line. We can try to imagine what those weeks or months were like. The physical discomfort of the kang, the weight of it on the neck and shoulders, the way it would have rubbed the skin raw, the impossibility of sleeping comfortably, the need to rely on others for the most basic functions. The humiliation of being seen this way by people who had known his father, who had perhaps once treated him with the deference owed to a chief's eldest son. And the psychological reality, the boredom, the powerlessness, the long hours of having nothing to do but think. Think about how this had happened. Think about who was responsible. Think about what he might do if he ever got out. Think about the clan that had abandoned his family, that now held him prisoner, that had reduced him from the son of a brave warrior to a shuffling, humiliated captive. The secret history suggests that some people within the Takiat camp treated Temujin with small kindnesses. A man named Sorkin Shire is mentioned, a man who looked after Temujin on some of the nights, who spoke to him gently, who perhaps fed him without making the experience of being fed a further humiliation. There is also mention of Sorkin Shire's daughter, Katagan, who looked at the captive boy with something like sympathy. These small kindnesses would not be forgotten. Temujin had a memory for loyalty, and he had an equal memory for kindness received in moments of helplessness. Sorkin Shire and his family would feature again in his life, and when they did, he would remember. The escape, when it came, was a combination of luck, opportunity, and desperate courage. It was the night of a festival, one of the great seasonal celebrations when the Takiat people would feast and drink and dance and, eventually, collapse into a deep and wine-soaked sleep. Temujin was guarded more loosely than usual, perhaps because the camp was full and everyone assumed someone else was watching him, or perhaps because the guards themselves had been celebrating. He ran. With the kang still around his neck, he ran toward the river. The Onan River was his river, the river of his childhood, the river where he had learned to fish with bent needles, the river whose banks he knew by feel in the dark. He threw himself into it and lay still in the shallows, the kang holding his head above water, the current cold around him, and he waited. The camp woke. Torches were lit. People searched. And it was then that Sorkin Shira found the fugitive boy lying in the shallows of the river, shivering, exhausted. Sorkin Shira could have turned him in. Doing so would have been safe, politically prudent, and would have earned him the gratitude of the Takiat leaders. Not turning him in was dangerous if discovered. He risked severe punishment for letting a prisoner escape. He let Temujin go. He told him to return to his mother. He may even have helped remove or loosen the Kang. And then he sent him away into the darkness. Temujin made his way through the night, through the forest he knew so well, back to whatever remained of his family's camp. He was perhaps 13 or 14 years old. He had survived captivity, survived humiliation, survived the Kang and the display and the Takiat power. And he had survived with his mind sharpened by all of it, sharpened by the understanding of how power worked, of how people treated the powerless, of what it felt like to be utterly without resources and utterly dependent on the mercy of others. He would never forget that feeling. And he would spend the rest of his life ensuring that he would never feel it again. Part 6: The Return to Borte, and the Forging of Alliances. After his escape from the Takiats, Temujin returned to his mother and siblings. The family had survived in his absence. Hoyland's resilience was not diminished by any adversity she faced, but they remained in the same precarious, marginal position. A small group, without powerful allies, on a steppe where power was everything. What Temujin needed, he understood with a clarity that went beyond his years, was alliances. Real alliances. Not the kind that evaporated when the wind changed, but alliances built on something solid enough to survive hardship. He needed friends who were also capable and brave. He needed a patron. And he needed, above all, the thing that would formalize his position in steppe society, a wife. Because a man without a wife on the Mongolian steppe was not yet fully a man in the social sense. Marriage was the foundation of the household, and the household was the foundation of everything. A married man with his own gur, his own fire, his own growing family and herd, that was a man who was building something real in the world. An unmarried adolescent living in his widowed mother's tent was, however brave and however clever, still a boy. Temujin went to Day Sechen's camp to claim Borte. He was perhaps 15 or 16. The betrothal had been agreed years ago, before his father's death, before everything that had happened since. In the intervening years, while Temujin had been surviving on roots and river fish and escaping from the Kang, Borte had been growing up in her own family's camp, being prepared for the life of a Mongolian wife and future mistress of a household. Day Sechen honored the agreement. Whatever he saw in Temujin, and he must have seen something compelling in the thin young man who came to claim what had been promised, he gave his daughter to him. And Borte came with a gift, a magnificent black sable coat, rich and warm and enormously valuable on the steppe, where furs of that quality were worth more than most people's entire herds. That sable coat would prove to be one of the most consequential garments in history. But before we come to that, let us dwell for a moment on what this reunion, or perhaps this first true meeting, since they had been very young when betrothed, must have been like. Two young people, strangers really, brought together by a negotiation made years before by a father who was now dead. Temujin, scarred by his years of poverty and captivity, carrying in his body and his mind all the weight of what he had endured. Borte, the daughter of a prosperous man, raised with more security and ease, but about to step into a life that would be far from easy. The secret history gives us very little of their private interaction. But in the years that follow, across all the chaos and violence and upheaval of Temujin's rise, Borte is consistently present, consistently important, consistently his most trusted advisor. This is not the portrait of a marriage that was merely political. This is the portrait of a partnership. Now, Temujin had his wife. And he had the sable coat. And with that coat, he made his next move, the move that would begin to change everything. He went to find Togrul. Togrul was the Khan, the leader of the Karate tribe. The Karates were one of the most powerful tribes on the central steppe, significantly larger and more formidable than anything the Mongols could currently muster. Togrul was a complex man, a Christian, as it happened, or at least an Nestorian Christian, member of a branch of Christianity that had spread across Central Asia along the Silk Road centuries earlier. He was also a seasoned survivor of steppe politics, a man who had murdered his brothers and nephews to secure his own power, a man who had been exiled and had fought his way back to his throne. He was also the man who had been Yasugei's Anda, a sworn brotherhood companion. In Mongolian tradition, Anda was one of the most sacred bonds that existed between two men. Not merely friendship, not merely alliance, but a ritualized, sworn bond of brotherhood that was meant to last beyond death, to extend to one's children and children's children. Temujin came to Togrul and invoked that bond. He gave Togrul the sable coat, a magnificent gift, worthy of a king, and he said, in essence, "My father was your Anda. In his memory, in the name of that bond, take me under your protection." And Togrul said yes. This was the moment the tide began to turn. Because with the Karate Khan's patronage, even nominal, even loosely defined, Temujin had access to something he had lacked since his father's death: legitimacy. He was no longer just a young nobody from a disgraced, abandoned family. He was a young man with the backing, however qualified, of one of the steppe's most powerful leaders. He also had, around this time, another crucial relationship developing: his friendship with Jamuka. This friendship would become one of the great complex relationships of his life, part brotherhood, part rivalry, ultimately tragic. Jamuka was also a Mongol, also young, also ambitious. He and Temujin had actually known each other as children. The secret history tells us they had been childhood playmates, had exchanged gifts and sworn the Anda bond together as boys. Now, as young men, they renewed that bond. They exchanged golden arrows and slept under the same blanket, as the custom of Anda brotherhood required. They rode together. They learned from each other. Jamuka was brilliant. He had a mind for strategy and politics that was, by all accounts, as sharp as Temujin's own. He also had something Temujin lacked: existing followers, an existing base of support among some of the Mongol clans. For a year and a half, the two friends traveled together, living in adjacent camps, building their combined forces. But the alliance between them, for all its genuine affection, contained within it the seed of an inevitable conflict. Because both men had the temperament of leaders, not followers. Both had the vision and the will to command. And the steppe, in the end, was not large enough for two. The parting, when it came, was ostensibly over a minor disagreement about where to camp. One account says it was about the placement of their respective camps at a river ford. But both men would have known that the real issue was larger than any campsite. It was about who would lead. And so they separated, each taking his followers, and each beginning the long work of building something greater than himself. That separation would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. And for Jamuka, it would ultimately be fatal. Part 7: The Abduction of Borte, and its Aftermath. Remember the Merkits. Remember that years ago, nearly 2 decades before the events we are now describing, Yasujii had stolen Hoilan from a Merkit warrior named Chiladu. Remember that the Merkits had not forgotten that on the steppe, grievances did not expire. That the logic of reciprocity, of taking what was taken from you, ran deeper than almost anything else in the culture of these tribes. The Merkits had been watching Temujin's household with the patient attention of people who have been waiting a long time for an opportunity. And now they saw one. One night, a warning came. A man riding hard from the direction of the steppe brought the alarm. Merkit warriors were approaching. Many of them. Too many to fight. There was no time for anything but flight. Temujin and his brothers and the men who were with him leaped onto their horses and rode hard for the forest, for the sacred mountain called Burkhan Khaldun, a place of deep spiritual significance for the Borjigin clan, a place where Tingri's presence was felt to be especially close. Riding hard for the mountain meant abandoning the camp. It meant abandoning the cattle. It meant abandoning the gur. And it meant abandoning Borte. The secret history is fairly blunt about this. There were not enough horses. Or the horses were not fast enough. Or the choices made in those terrifying few minutes were choices that prioritized the men over the women. Borte was put on a cart, a slow, ox-drawn cart, and she and a servant named Quachin were left behind when the Merkits swept into the camp. The Merkits took Borte. They gave her to the brother of Chiladu, the man from whom Yasujii had stolen Hoilan years before. This was the revenge explicitly stated in the secret history. The Merkits said that they were repaying the theft of Hoilan by taking Yasujii's son's wife in her place. The symmetry was deliberate. The message was clear. Temujin, safe on the mountain, wept. The secret history records that he beat his breast and prayed to Tengri and Itujin, asking for their strength and protection. He prayed for 3 days, the specific number that carried ritual significance in Mongolian tradition. He descended the mountain only when his faithful horse Kasar had found him, the animal somehow having survived the raid. Now the questions. Because we must ask them, even if we cannot fully answer them. Was Temujin's abandonment of Borte an act of cowardice? Was it a rational military decision, preserve the fighters who can eventually win her back wrapped in the necessity of the moment? Was it some combination of both? And how did Borte feel about it, in those months of captivity with the Merkits? The secret history does not answer these questions directly. It does show us Temujin in visible anguish about what had happened, praying, beating his chest, clearly in pain. But it also does not shy away from the fact that he rode away and left her. What it does tell us is that Temujin wasted no time once he had recovered himself. He went immediately to his 2 most powerful allies, Togrul and Jamuka, and called in whatever obligations they owed him. He invoked the Anda bond with both of them. He appealed to their self-interest. The Merkits were a threat to everyone, and a strong response would send a message. And he appealed, perhaps most powerfully, to something simpler. Borte had been taken. He needed to get her back. The response was significant. Togrul came with 20,000 warriors. Jamuka came with an equal force. Combined with whatever Temujin could muster himself, this was an overwhelming military response to what had been a raid. It was not a punitive expedition. It was an army. They rode on the Merkit camps in the dark, from 3 directions simultaneously, and the attack was so sudden and so overwhelming that resistance was minimal. The Merkit camps were scattered, their people fleeing in terror across the darkened steppe, some taking to boats on the Selenge River to escape. And Temujin rode through the chaos calling Borte's name. He held her. And here the story becomes complicated in a way that the secret history handles with remarkable directness, given its generally celebratory tone toward its subject. Because Borte was pregnant. She had been among the Merkits for some months, the exact number is not clear, but enough for a pregnancy to be visible or known. The father of the child she was carrying could not be determined with certainty. She gave birth to a son shortly afterward. They named him Joki, the word meaning guest in some interpretations, a name that itself carried the ambiguity of his origins. Joki would go on to have a significant life of his own, to be one of Temujin's most capable and conflicted sons. But the shadow of his uncertain paternity would follow him always, and it would eventually contribute to tensions within the family that would outlast Genghis Khan himself. Temujin accepted Joki as his son. He raised him as his son. He never, in any surviving account, openly rejected or disowned him. But neither did he ever fully resolve the question. And the silence around it, the careful non-acknowledgement of what everyone knew was uncertain, tells its own story about the complexity of a marriage tested by an unimaginable crisis and held together by will, and by love, and by the practical requirements of building something together. Part 8: The Rise of a Leader, Gathering Followers. After the rescue of Borte, something changed. Not in Temujin himself, perhaps he had always had the qualities that made men follow him. But in how the world perceived him. The rescue of Borte had required the coordination of tens of thousands of warriors across multiple tribes. It had required the kind of personal relationships and political skill that took years to build. And the execution of the attack had demonstrated genuine military competence, the night assault from 3 directions, the overwhelming force, the careful logistics of moving a large army across the steppe without being detected until the moment of impact. Word spread. Word always spread on the steppe, carried by the riders who moved between camps with the speed of the wind. A young man named Temujin, son of Yasugi Baghader, had gathered an army and destroyed a Merkit camp. The Merkits, significant, feared, had been scattered like smoke. And warriors began to come. Not many at first. A few men here, a small family group there. But they came. They came because on the steppe, men followed strength, followed the person who seemed most likely to provide them with security and success. And Temujin was beginning to seem like that person. But Temujin's approach to building his following was different from the norm, and this is important. The traditional way to build a band of followers on the steppe was through the kinship system. You gathered your relatives, you rallied your clan, you extended your influence through the networks of blood and marriage that already existed. This was the conservative, traditional approach, and it had obvious advantages. It leveraged existing loyalties, existing structures of obligation. Temujin did this too, of course. But he also did something different. He actively recruited beyond kinship lines. He brought in men from other clans, other tribes, men who had no blood connection to the Borjigin, who came to him purely because of his reputation and the promise of what following him might mean. He promoted these men based on merit, on demonstrated loyalty and skill, rather than on birth. He gave positions of trust and responsibility to men who had been nobody, who had nothing to offer except their ability and their loyalty. This was radical. On the steppe, where kinship was the fundamental organizing principle of society, where the clan determined your place in the world as surely as the sun determined the direction of east. Choosing followers on the basis of merit rather than blood was a revolutionary act. It created a different kind of army, more flexible, more dependent on Temujin personally as the source of reward and rank, and therefore more loyal to him as an individual rather than to a kinship structure that might eventually supersede him. He also developed, in these years, a group of personal companions, the Noker, which translates roughly as companion or friend, who were bound to him by personal loyalty of the most intense kind. These were men who had chosen him, and whom he had chosen back, and the bond between them was mutual in a way that the kinship bond was not. They had given up their clan affiliations, in a sense, to follow him. This made them entirely dependent on his success. And it made him entirely dependent on their skill and courage. Among the most important of these early companions was a man named Jelm, one of the sons of a blacksmith, who had been given to Yasujii as a servant when Temujin was born and who had remained loyal through all the difficult years. There was also Sabidii, who would grow up to become perhaps the greatest general of the Mongol Empire, a man of legendary tactical brilliance who would eventually lead armies into Russia, Poland, and Hungary. And there was Bohorshu, whose story is worth telling in some detail. Bohorshu was the son of a moderately prosperous man named Naku the Rich. He was a young man when he first encountered Temujin, and the encounter happened in the most improbable way. Temujin's horses had been stolen. Horse theft was the great crime of the steppe, equivalent in its consequences to something between robbery and attempted murder, since without horses a steppe family was effectively immobilized and helpless. Temujin set out alone to recover them. On his search, he came across Bohorshu's father's camp. Bohorshu, apparently struck by something in the young stranger, his bearing, his directness, the urgency of his quest, not only gave him food and rest, but joined him. Without asking his father's permission. Without calculating the risk. He simply picked up his quiver and his bow and said, in effect, "I'm coming with you." They found the stolen horses. They recovered them. And Bohorshu, having spent those days on the road with Temujin, returned to his father's camp only to say goodbye. He wanted to join Temujin permanently. His father let him go. The old man was perceptive enough to see what his son saw. Bohorshu would become one of Temujin's most trusted generals and companions, a figure whose loyalty never wavered through decades of war and upheaval. When Temujin was asked in later years who his most important friends were, Bohorshu's name was always among the first. These early followers, Bohorshu, Jelm, Sabidii, and the dozens and eventually hundreds who came after them, were being forged in these years into something new. Not just a raiding party, not just a clan militia, but the beginning of an army. An army that operated on principles of organization and loyalty that were more sophisticated and more durable than anything else on the steppe. And as the army grew, so did Temujin's reputation. And as his reputation grew, more warriors came. The virtuous circle was beginning to turn. Part 9: The War Against the Tatars and the Weight of Memory. The Tatars. This name had been the first dark word of Temujin's life, the people who had, according to the tradition of his family, poisoned his father Yasujii on a road somewhere on the steppe. Whether or not this was literally true, it was what Temujin believed, or at least what he had been told. The Tatars were the enemy. The Tatars were the reason he had grown up without a father, had starved and foraged and been humiliated, had worn the kang around his neck and hidden in river shallows in the dark. But the conflict with the Tatars was not merely personal. It was structural. The Tatars were one of the most powerful forces on the eastern steppe, and their relationship with the great powers to the south, particularly the Jin dynasty, which ruled northern China, gave them resources and political backing that made them a constant threat to the various Mongolian clans. The Tatars had been involved in a long-standing relationship with the Jin dynasty, sometimes as clients, sometimes as mercenaries, always as a buffer force that the Jin used to keep the steppe tribes divided and weak. Around 1196, an opportunity presented itself. The Jin dynasty was conducting a punitive campaign against the Tatars, a military expedition to discipline a tribe that had grown too independent, too powerful, too difficult to manage. And Togrul, Temujin's patron, was invited to assist. Temujin joined the campaign. It was, in military terms, a relatively straightforward operation. The combined forces of Togrul, Temujin, and the Jin army caught the Tatars in a classic two-direction squeeze and inflicted a decisive defeat. The Tatar leader Meghujin Sulta was killed. The Tatar camps were overrun. An enormous amount of plunder was taken. For Temujin, the practical and the personal coincided in this battle with a peculiar intensity. He was fighting enemies he had been taught to hate since childhood. He was fighting in alliance with a power, the Jin, that represented everything the nomadic steppe world was supposed to be antagonistic to: settled, agricultural, bureaucratic, southern. And he was winning. The Jin court, afterward, rewarded their allies. Togrul received a prestigious title. Temujin received a lesser title, Jayudi Kuri, which signified a border official or commander, but it was a title nonetheless. It represented official recognition by one of the great powers of the age. For a man who had grown up abandoned and enslaved on the margins of steppe society, this recognition was not a small thing. The campaign against the Tatars was also the occasion for one of the earliest demonstrations of Temujin's organizational genius in battle, a principle that he would maintain throughout his life and that would become a hallmark of Mongol military practice. After the victory, his men began, as was customary, to scatter through the enemy camp to loot individually, each man grabbing what he could. Temujin stopped this. He ordered the plunder to be collected centrally and then distributed according to a system, according to rank, according to contribution, according to a principle of ordered sharing rather than chaotic grabbing. This seems like a small administrative decision. But in the context of the steppe, where every victory had always been followed by undisciplined individual looting, it was transformative. It meant that everyone who had fought received a share, not just the fastest and most aggressive. It meant that Temujin controlled the distribution of reward, which meant that his followers were dependent on him for their prosperity in a way they had not been before. And it created an incentive to follow orders, because following orders was now what got you your fair share. He was building the architecture of an empire, one small practical decision at a time. Meanwhile, on the personal level, the years of his young manhood were years of growing family as well as growing power. Borte bore him more children after Joki, sons and daughters who would eventually grow up to play their own significant roles in the story of the Mongol world. The gur that had once housed a poverty-stricken widow and her brood was growing into a proper camp, with horses and cattle and followers and the smell of cooked meat rather than boiled roots. Hoilan was still there. She is mentioned in the sources as an active, present figure throughout these years, not sidelined, not relegated to a corner, but visible, engaged, respected. The woman who had fed her children on roots and river fish while grieving a stolen husband was now watching her eldest son build something that she could perhaps barely comprehend in its full scope, but could recognize for what it was: a reversal. A reclamation. the undoing of all that had been taken. How much of Temujin's drive was rooted in these memories of hunger, of cold, of the Kang, of the Takiats riding away with the clan banners is impossible to say with certainty. But the secret history, written by people who knew him or knew those who knew him, suggests that these memories never left him. That the boy who had lain in the river's shallows in the dark was always present inside the man who was accumulating power at such breathtaking speed. Part 10, Jamuka and the Fracture of Brotherhood. The story of Temujin and Jamuka is one of the most compelling and ultimately heartbreaking threads in the entire story of Genghis Khan's rise. It is a story about two extraordinarily capable men who were perhaps more alike than either of them could comfortably acknowledge, who formed one of the closest bonds that the steppe tradition recognized, and who were ultimately destroyed, one of them literally, by the fact that the world in which they lived was not large enough for both their visions. We have already met Jamuka, the childhood friend, the renewed Anda, the companion of a year and a half of joint campaigning. After their separation, the two men had followed parallel tracks. Both had been building followings. Both had been winning battles, forming alliances, establishing reputations. And both had been moving on a trajectory that would inevitably bring them into direct competition. The first major open conflict between them came around 1187, in what is known as the Battle of Dallin Balsut. The precipitating incident, as these things often are, was relatively minor, a conflict between their respective followers in which men on Temujin's side were killed. But the response was major. Jamuka moved against Temujin with a force that was, at this stage, larger than anything Temujin could muster. He defeated Temujin decisively, scattered his forces, captured some of his followers. And then Jamuka did something that the secret history presents as a turning point in the moral narrative of the conflict between them. He boiled alive some of the captured enemy commanders. He boiled them in cauldrons, a form of execution that was considered extremely brutal even by the standards of an age that was not faint-hearted about violence. The message was deliberate, it was meant to terrorize, to demonstrate that Jamuka's victory came with a price for those who had opposed him. The effect was the opposite of what he intended. Or perhaps in addition to what he intended. Because while it certainly communicated ruthlessness, it also communicated a kind of arbitrary, uncontrolled cruelty that frightened people in a different way. Not the fear of a powerful leader who would protect his followers, but the fear of a man whose violence was not calibrated, not purposeful, not bounded by the conventions that even steppe warfare recognized. And so, paradoxically, after Jamuka's victory over Temujin, more people began coming to Temujin's side. The secret history is clear about this dynamic. When people saw what Jamuka did to the captives, they chose Temujin. They chose the man who seemed, despite his own considerable capacity for violence, to exercise that violence with more purpose and more restraint. Temujin lost the battle but won something more important, the beginning of a moral reputation. On the steppe, where reputation was one of the most durable forms of currency, this mattered enormously. After Dallin Balsut, Temujin retreated and regrouped. He did not collapse. He did not despair. He went back to the work of building, gathering more followers, strengthening his relationships with Togrul, extending his network of alliances into corners of the steppe where he had not previously reached. And he waited. Because one of the things that the hard years of his childhood had taught him, more thoroughly perhaps than anything else, was patience. The ability to endure. The knowledge that conditions change, that the man who survives long enough will eventually find his moment. Jamuka, in the years that followed, made his own moves toward greater power. He sought the title of Gur Khan, a title meaning something like Universal Khan, a claim to leadership over all the tribes. He gathered his own coalition. He continued to win battles and expand his influence. But something was different about Jamuka's leadership, and the secret history captures it in a way that is probably ideologically colored, written as it was to glorify Temujin, but that may also reflect a genuine difference in temperament. Jamuka was brilliant, but he was also, by many accounts, volatile. Unpredictable. The relationship between him and his followers seems to have been characterized by a kind of brilliance that attracted people and a mercurial quality that eventually drove them away. Men came to Jamuka and then left him, finding their way eventually to Temujin. Among those who made this journey were some of the most significant figures of the emerging Mongol world. Quildar, a warrior of great renown. Mukhali, who would become one of Temujin's greatest generals. Even some members of the traditional aristocracy, the chiefs of minor Mongol clans who might have been expected to resist Temujin's somewhat irregular rise, found themselves drawn to him rather than to Jamuka. The reasons were various. But they kept returning to the same themes. Temujin was predictable in the most important ways. He rewarded loyalty, punished betrayal, shared plunder fairly, and did not execute his own people for his own amusement. He was calculating, yes. He was ruthless when he needed to be. But his ruthlessness had a logic to it that his followers could understand and work within. Jamuka's brilliance was dazzling but unreliable. Temujin's competence was steadier, more dependable. The rivalry between them would continue for years, twisting through the great political conflicts of the late 12th century steppe, allying them sometimes against common enemies, separating them again as those enemies were defeated. The final chapter of their story would not come until much later. But even in these early years, the shape of it was becoming visible. Two Anda brothers. Two men who had slept under the same blanket and exchanged golden arrows and sworn the most solemn bond the steppe recognized. And between them, stretching across the years, a competition so total and so fundamental that it could only end with one of them destroyed. Part 11. The Great Kurultai. Temujin becomes Genghis Khan. By the early years of the 13th century, specifically around 1206, Temujin had accomplished something that no one on the Mongolian steppe had ever fully accomplished before. He had unified the Mongol tribes. Let us dwell on what that means. Because the word unified is clean and simple, and the reality it describes was anything but. The unification of the Mongolian steppe had been attempted before, by Kabul Khan a generation before Temujin's birth, and had not held. The steppe's political history was a history of fragmentation, of coalitions that formed and dissolved, of tribal identities so fierce and so deep that they resisted any larger loyalty. For generations and generations, the tribes had raided each other, fought each other, betrayed each other, and returned to their separate identities when the crisis that had briefly united them was past. What Temujin had done, over roughly 2 decades of continuous warfare and political maneuvering, was something qualitatively different. He had not merely formed a coalition. He had destroyed the tribal system itself. This is a statement that requires some explanation. The traditional organization of steppe society was based on the clan and the tribe, kinship groups organized by blood, with their own leaders, their own territories, their own internal hierarchies. These structures gave people their identities, their loyalties, their place in the world. They were robust and flexible and had persisted for centuries. Temujin's revolution was to dismantle them. Not in the sense of killing everyone who had ever belonged to a tribe, but in the sense of replacing tribal loyalty as the fundamental organizing principle with loyalty to him personally and through him, to the army structure he had built. He reorganized his forces not by clan or tribal affiliation but into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, the decimal system that would become one of the hallmarks of Mongol military organization. These units were led by commanders appointed by him on the basis of merit and demonstrated loyalty, not on the basis of birth. A man from one tribe might find himself in a unit commanded by a man from a rival tribe, fighting alongside men from a dozen different backgrounds. His identity was no longer primarily Merkit or Tatar or Nayman. It was Mongol, and more specifically, it was soldier of Temujin. This was genius. Because it destroyed the very mechanism by which steppe empires had always fallen apart, the persistence of subgroup loyalties that eventually reasserted themselves against the supreme leader. By mixing people across their old tribal lines, by making the decimal unit the new primary community, Temujin created a force that was loyal to him and to the system he had built rather than to the accident of birth. He also, in these years before 1206, dealt definitively with his remaining enemies and rivals. The Naymans, a powerful western tribe, were defeated in a decisive campaign. The Merkits, who had haunted his life since their abduction of Borte, were finally destroyed as a significant force. The Tatars, the tribe held responsible for his father's death, were dealt with in a campaign of terrifying thoroughness that became one of the most discussed episodes in the entire history of his rise. The Tatars had been defeated militarily. But Temujin did not consider military defeat sufficient. He ordered a calculation: every Tatar man taller than the axle of a cartwheel was to be killed. Children too young to reach that height would be spared and absorbed into Mongol households. The women would be distributed among the warriors as wives and concubines. This was genocide in any honest language, the deliberate destruction of a people as a people. And it was carried out systematically, methodically, with the cold organizational efficiency that characterized everything Temujin did. The Tatars had been the enemies of his family, the killers of his father. They were also, in the political landscape he was building, a potential source of resistance that could not be left alive as a distinct ethnic and political entity. The thoroughness of it, and the fact that it was carried out not in anger, not in the heat of battle, but as a calculated policy decided in advance, tells us something important about the man Temujin was becoming. He was not impulsive. He was deliberate. His violence was purposeful, architectural, aimed at specific outcomes in the world he was building. That made it, in many ways, more frightening than impulsive violence. Because it would not be checked by mercy or sentiment. Only by calculation. And calculation, in this case, allowed for one exception. Among the Tatar captives was a young woman named Yasogei, some accounts call her Isue, of extraordinary beauty and bearing. Temujin took her as a wife. He also took her sister, Yasujin. Both women would become significant figures in his household. Isue in particular would grow into one of his most trusted and beloved consorts, a woman whose counsel he sought on important matters. But it was Jamuka who remained the final unresolved thread of this period of consolidation. The two old Anda brothers had fought on opposite sides of multiple campaigns as the steppe's political landscape shifted and realigned. Jamuka had gathered and lost coalitions, had been the center of resistance to Temujin's growing dominance, had fought brilliantly and lost repeatedly, not because he lacked military skill but because the forces arrayed against him had become, under Temujin's organization, qualitatively different from anything the old steppe traditions of warfare had produced. In the end, Jamuka was betrayed by his own followers. They captured him and brought him to Temujin, apparently hoping for reward. Temujin's response was to execute the men who had betrayed their own leader, because loyalty was the supreme value in the world he was building, and men who would betray their master were not men he wanted in his service, regardless of the favor they thought they were doing him. And then he faced Jamuka. The secret history describes this final meeting between the two Anda brothers with a depth of feeling that suggests it drew on real memory, real emotion, the kind of detail that gets preserved in oral tradition because it is true in the deepest sense, because it captures something essential about the people involved. Temujin wept. He offered Jamuka his life, his freedom, a place at his side. He reminded him of their old bond, the golden arrows, the blanket they had shared, the years of friendship. He said, in essence, "Come back to me. The world I am building has a place for you in it." Jamuka refused. Whether out of pride, or out of clear-eyed realism about what it would mean to exist permanently in Temujin's shadow, or out of genuine conviction that a world organized according to Temujin's principles was not a world he wanted to inhabit, we cannot say. Perhaps some of all three. He asked only for a death without bloodshed. This was the traditional request of a noble prisoner, death by broken back or neck, which shed no blood, rather than by blade. On the steppe, blood had spiritual significance, and to die without bleeding was to die with a kind of dignity. Temujin granted it. And Jamuka, the most brilliant rival of Temujin's entire rise, died with the same quiet dignity with which the secret history records his final hours, not begging, not raging, simply accepting the end of a story that had always been going to end this way. Now there were no more rivals. And so, in the spring of 1206, on the banks of the Onan River, the river of Temujin's birth, the river where he had hidden in the shallows with a kang around his neck, the great Kurultai was convened. A Kurultai was a great assembly, a gathering of all the leaders, all the chiefs, all the significant people of the Mongolian world. They came from every direction, representatives of every clan and tribe that had been brought under Temujin's banner. They came to the white felt banner. The white felt banner was the symbol of peaceful sovereignty, as the black felt banner was the symbol of war, and they knelt. They raised Temujin up. The title they gave him was Genghis Khan. Or in the more familiar rendering of Western sources, Genghis Khan. The exact meaning of the title has been debated by scholars for generations. The most widely accepted interpretation is that it means something like universal ruler or ruler of the oceans, with the ocean as a metaphor for the entirety of the world. Others have suggested it means fierce or hard or relates to a specific Turkic word for strength or force. Whatever its precise etymology, the meaning was clear enough in context. This was not merely a tribal chief. This was not the leader of a confederation. This was the ruler of a new kind of entity, something that the steppe had never seen before and would not see again, a unified Mongolian state, organized on new principles, pointing toward a horizon that was larger than any of the assembled people could yet fully imagine. The great shaman Kokshiv, known by his title Tebtingri, the most heavenly, rose to proclaim that Tingri, the eternal blue sky, had decreed that Temujin was to rule the world. This was not merely a blessing. It was a cosmological statement. It placed Temujin's authority within the framework of divine mandate, not just the strongest man on the steppe, not just the most politically skilled, but the chosen instrument of the sky god himself. Genghis Khan. The title hung in the spring air over the Onan River. The white banner of sovereignty caught the wind. Tens of thousands of warriors knelt on the grass of the great steppe. The boy who had been abandoned. The boy who had worn the kang. The boy who had lain in the river's shallows in the dark, listening for footsteps. The young man who had wept when Borte was taken, who had fought and lost and rebuilt and fought again, who had killed his own half-brother over a fish and prayed on a sacred mountain and watched his childhood friend die at his command. He had become Genghis Khan. And this was only the beginning. Part 12, The Architecture of Empire, What the Childhood Built. It is a temptation, at the end of a story like this one, to draw clean lines between the childhood and the empire. To say, here is where the poverty created the hunger for security. Here is where the abandonment created the worship of loyalty. Here is where the humiliation created the absolute intolerance of disrespect. And there is truth in these connections, more truth, perhaps, than we sometimes find in the neat psychological explanations we apply to great historical figures. But the reality is more complicated and more interesting than any single explanation. Because Temujin was not simply a product of his trauma, however formative that trauma was. He was a person of extraordinary and diverse abilities, military, political, psychological, organizational, that went far beyond what any particular childhood experience could explain. He had, in addition to whatever damage his hard years had done, a genuine and remarkable intelligence, a capacity for strategic thinking that seems to have been native to him, a social perceptiveness about people and their motivations that was almost uncanny. But let us trace what the childhood did build. Because those connections are real and important, and understanding them helps us understand not just the man but the empire. The first thing the childhood built was a philosophy of loyalty that was more absolute, more precisely articulated, and more systematically enforced than anything the steppe had previously known. The man who had been abandoned by his clan, who had survived only because a few individuals, Sorkin Shira, Boarshu, the faithful horse that found him on Burkhan Khaldun, chose loyalty over safety or calculation, understood loyalty in a way that those who had never been without it could not. He valued it with the intensity of someone who had nearly died for the lack of it. And he built it into the foundation of every institution he created. In the Mongol world under Genghis Khan, loyalty to one's superior was the supreme value, more important than tribal identity, more important than religion, more important in practical terms than almost anything else. And disloyalty, betrayal, was punished with absolute finality. Not always immediately, and sometimes with an almost eerie patience. But always, eventually, with completeness. The second thing the childhood built was a profound understanding of the relationship between poverty and power. Genghis Khan never forgot what it was to have nothing. And because he never forgot, he was attentive to the material needs of his followers in a way that many leaders are not. He understood that a hungry warrior is an unreliable warrior. That a man who is worried about feeding his family is a man who may make calculations that put his family's survival above his general's orders. He therefore devoted considerable energy to ensuring that his army was fed, equipped, and rewarded, and that the system of plunder distribution he had developed in those early campaigns was maintained and systematized throughout the empire. The decimal system of military organization, those units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, was not just tactically brilliant. It was also a welfare system of a kind. Each unit was responsible for its members. Each unit commander was responsible for ensuring his men were equipped and fed. The obligations ran both upward and downward through the hierarchy, creating a web of mutual responsibility that was more robust than the kinship system it replaced. The third thing that childhood built was an attitude toward the existing social hierarchy that was genuinely radical. Genghis Khan had been born into the lower rungs of Mongolian aristocracy, had been reduced to its very margins, and had rebuilt himself entirely through his own ability and force of will. This gave him a relationship with birth-based hierarchy that was, at best, instrumental. He used it when it was useful. His Borgigian lineage mattered, and he knew it mattered, but he felt no obligation to perpetuate it as the organizing principle of the world he was building. Some of his most important appointments went to men of entirely humble birth. Sabiti, who would become the greatest general of the empire, was the son of a blacksmith. Jebe, another of his greatest commanders, had actually once been an enemy, a warrior who had shot Temujin's horse from under him in battle. Temujin had sought him out afterward and offered him a command, impressed by the courage and skill of a man who had come close to killing him. This was not magnanimity in the conventional sense. It was the recognition that talent was valuable wherever it was found, and that the accident of birth was a poor guide to where talent resided. The Yasa also established protections for merchants and trade caravans. Genghis Khan had grown up in a world where the Silk Road passed not far to the south, where the flow of goods between China and the Mediterranean was an enormous source of wealth for those who could facilitate or tax it. He understood commerce in the way that a man who has been desperately poor understands it, as something enormously powerful, something that created wealth and connectivity and intelligence about distant places that could be as valuable as any army. And the fourth thing, perhaps the most personal, that the childhood built was a specific, sustained attentiveness to the human cost of betrayal and its opposite. The people who had been kind to Temujin in his years of powerlessness were rewarded, often decades later, with extraordinary generosity. Sorkin Shira, who had let him go from the river, whose family had hidden him and helped him when Genghis Khan came to power, he sought Sorkin Shira out and gave him great honors and gifts. He did not forget. The memory for kindness was as precise as the memory for injury. This pattern repeated itself throughout his life. The old woman who had warned his mother about the Takiat departure. The man who had treated him with dignity during his captivity. The father of Bohorshu, who had let his son go to follow a stranger. These people, and others like them, were found and rewarded when the power to reward them existed. Genghis Khan carried his debts, personal and historical, with him always, and he paid them. Now, the world beyond the steppe was watching all of this with a mixture of incomprehension and growing alarm. The Jin dynasty in northern China had been comfortable with a fragmented steppe. A dozen quarrelsome tribes were infinitely preferable to a unified force under a single, capable leader. The Tangut kingdom of Xixia, to the southwest, was watching. The great Islamic empires to the west, the Khwarezmian Empire, which stretched from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India, were far away enough to feel safe, but not far enough, as they would discover. The Mongol Empire that Genghis Khan was building would go on to accomplish things that, in the spring of 1206, would have seemed like the fantasies of a madman. His armies would reach the Pacific Ocean in the east and the shores of the Adriatic in the west. His descendants would sit on the thrones of Persia and China and Russia and Korea. His genetic legacy, scholars have estimated that as many as 16 million living people today are direct patrilineal descendants of Genghis Khan, is perhaps the most literally world-changing of any individual in history. And all of it, every campaign, every administrative innovation, every diplomatic calculation, every strategic decision, was built on the foundation of those early years. The roots that Hoyland dug from the riverbank. The fish caught on bent needles. The kang around a boy's neck in the dark. The river where he lay and listened for footsteps, holding his breath, waiting for the world to decide if he would live or die. The world decided he would live. And then he spent the rest of his life deciding the fates of worlds. There are historians who look at Genghis Khan and see only the conquest, the devastation, the unimaginable death tolls. Some estimates suggest that the Mongol campaigns of the 13th century reduced the global population by tens of millions, a proportion of total population that no other single military enterprise in history has matched. The cities of Central Asia, Merv, Samarkand, Nishapur, Urgench, that had been among the most sophisticated urban centers in the world, libraries and observatories and markets of unparalleled richness, were reduced to rubble and empty land. The great irrigation systems of Persia were destroyed in some places so thoroughly that land that had been fertile for millennia became desert. Populations that had taken centuries to grow were ended in weeks. This is real. It is important. It is not to be glossed over or explained away by the political necessity of imperial expansion. The destruction that the Mongol Empire brought was among the most catastrophic in human history, and the people who died in it were as fully human as the man who ordered their deaths. But there are also historians who look at what the Mongol Empire created in its stable periods, the Pax Mongolica, the era when the enormous expanse of the empire was governed well enough that a traveler could, in theory, journey safely from China to Persia, that merchants could move along the Silk Road without the constant threat of local bandits or feuding lords, that ideas and technologies moved between civilizations with a freedom they had never had before. They point to the printing techniques that moved from China to Persia, to the astronomical knowledge that moved from the Islamic world to East Asia, to the early emergence of a connected Eurasian world that was in some ways the ancestor of the globalization of today. Both things are true. The Mongol Empire was both catastrophic and creative. It ended things and it enabled things. And both the destruction and the creation flow from the same source, from the man who was raised in the world of the steppe, who understood power with a clarity that came from having had none, who built an empire on the principles he had forged in hunger and captivity and the long nights of a boyhood that offered no safety and no certainty. But here, tonight, we are not concerned with the empire in its full terrible splendor. We have followed the boy, not the conqueror. We have traced the life from the Onon River to the Kurultai of 1206, from the moment of a birth announced by a blood clot in a closed fist to the moment when a name was given that would echo through 8 centuries. Genghis Khan. Universal ruler. Instrument of the eternal blue sky. A small boy who was cold and hungry and had his fish taken away from him. Both of these things are true at once. And the space between them, the distance from one to the other, measured not in miles but in suffering and resilience and the kind of will that the steppe teaches to those it does not kill, is one of the most extraordinary journeys in all of human history. He is gone now, of course. He died in 1227, at a campaign in the mountains, of causes that remain debated: a fall from a horse, perhaps, or illness, or a wound. He was buried in secret, somewhere in the mountains of Mongolia, in a location so deliberately concealed that it has never been found. The secret history tells us that warriors rode their horses over his grave to obliterate any trace of it, that rivers were diverted, that trees were planted. He had built an empire that stretched across the world, and he was buried in a place that has never been found. There is something fitting in that. Something about the man who had hidden in river shallows and in mountain forests and in the dense stands of birch and pine along the Onon. Something about the boy who had learned, very young, How to become invisible when the world was too large and too dangerous to face directly. He hides still, somewhere in the Mongolian earth, under the eternal blue sky that he believed had chosen him. Closing meditation. The fire has burned low. Somewhere on the steppe, if you close your eyes and let the image come, the grass is silver in the moonlight. The Onan River moves quietly between its banks, dark and cold and unhurried. The stars overhead are enormous and dense, the way they are in places where there are no city lights to dim them, the way they were 900 years ago when a boy crouched by the water's edge and looked up and wondered what the sky wanted from him. Let that image rest gently behind your eyes. The river. The stars. The vast, breathing silence of the grassland at night. We have traveled very far tonight. Across centuries. Across thousands of miles of open steppe. Through hunger and cold and captivity and loss and the slow, hard, improbable work of making something out of nothing. Through a childhood that was, in many ways, the opposite of gentle. And yet, these moments are not less real than the battles. They are, in some ways, more real. They are the texture of an actual human life, lived under impossible conditions, finding joy and connection wherever the hardness of the world allowed room for it. Let your body settle a little deeper now. Feel the pillow beneath your head. Feel the steady, quiet rhythm of your breathing. The steppe is very far away. And 900 years is a very long time. You are here. You are warm. You are safe. Let your thoughts drift with the river. Let the images dissolve slowly into each other, the white felt banner, the silver grass, the enormous sky, becoming softer, becoming quieter, becoming the gentle nothing of deep rest. The eternal blue sky watches over everything tonight. As it always has. As it always will. Sleep now. Sleep. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.